Everything was good. Yeah, again, I'm sorry you weren't able to get into that other link. I thought I had it all set up right, but sometimes Google does that.
Don't worry. So we have a lot of people here to see you today. This is everybody, Jeffrey Tucker. If you haven't seen him before, he was the head of the Mises Institute, and he has his website, liberty.me. And he's one of the greatest thinkers of the Austrian School of Economics, in my opinion. I'm very glad to have you here today, Jeffrey.
It's my pleasure. Does my sound okay? The volume okay? Everything good?
Yeah, it's very good.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, wonderful. I guess I'll just begin then. So everybody can see me at this point, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's wonderful. Well, how's the conference gone so far?
It's going very well. I think for the talk session, more than I expected. I'd like to see more, of course, but it's been pretty great.
Yeah, it's exciting. Well, I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person with you today. I love nothing more than Bitcoin conferences because they're always the smartest people around. It's always a crowd of people who are thinking about the future, so that's very exciting. Well, I think maybe I'll give about 20 minutes or something, remarks. Is that okay?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, I think when you think about Bitcoin, it's important to think of Bitcoin as being something just not as an isolated phenomenon, not just something separated from the structure of the market that's developing in our times. Over the last 10 years, we've seen a whole suite of technologies that have begun to change the world in fundamental ways. It's a combination of processes and programs that have come together incredibly well in the case of Bitcoin. There's cryptography, of course, and open source programming, which is very important because it allows us to share knowledge in a Hayekian sense across the globe. And always improving technologies. There's also distributed networks, which to my mind are the greatest invention probably in the history of humanity, actually, and I can go into that a little bit later. There's also a tremendous intellectual apparatus behind Bitcoin and behind all of these peer-to-peer distributed technologies. In the case of Bitcoin, we have a particular sort of influence of the Austrian monetary theory here, which really began with Karl Menger and advanced through Ludwig von Mises, and then Murray Rothbard and F.A. Hayek. And I would say you would have to add Ishel Kerzner in here as an additional influence. So it's not five great figures behind the monetary apparatus of Bitcoin. In addition to that, what we've discovered, I think over the last 10 years, and maybe could extend it further to about 15 years only, really, is the incredible discovery of the value of network technology and finding value in digits themselves. It was only 10 or 15 years ago that most people didn't think the internet would ever be worth anything. I remember so many debunkers after the dot-com bust of 1999 thought that this new internet thing was just full of hot air. It wasn't going to amount to anything. It would have made no economic contribution whatsoever. And this is because people always tend to undervalue the role of information relative to physical capital. I was reading F.A. Hayek's Constitution of Liberty the other day, and he talks about information. It's actually, like, in terms of an Austrian sense, Hayek had a greater, more profound sense of the value of information than anybody else. And he talks about the value of information being more important than even physical capital to the development of civilization. And so with Bitcoin, you have a sort of an amazing capacity using cryptography, distributed networks, open source programming, and the incredible invention called the blockchain, coming together in a way that commodifies information bits, applies a title to them, and makes them non-forgeable and time-stamped, overcoming the tremendous technological limitations that had always existed for the creation of a new monetary technology. In the case of Bitcoin, the great sort of takeaway from Satoshi Nakamoto's invention was the impossibility of reproducing the currency unit, making it non-forgeable, and therefore eliminating the problem of double spending that had destroyed every previous attempt at digital currency innovation. People couldn't really figure out how to make it non-forgeable. It wasn't until Satoshi's blockchain came along that we were able to figure out that problem. It's extremely important for money, obviously, because scarcity is one of the main properties of money. There are other properties too, divisibility, which Bitcoin adheres to, fungibility, which means the interrelationship of one currency unit to another, non-destructibility, because you don't want money to wear out, portability, which Bitcoin has in spades. It's actually much better than gold in that sense. You want a high value per unit of weight, but that doesn't pertain to Bitcoin because it's actually weightless, which is the ideal situation. And what else do you need? You need a certain degree of capacity for universal distribution. And Bitcoin actually qualifies in that sense, since it is not a national money. It is international money. It wasn't invented by any government. It's not managed by any government. So it actually is an amazing thing in the sense that it sort of takes a cruddy technology called a national money that has been destroyed by governments for the last year, monopolized and therefore destroyed by governments for the last 100 years, reinvents the whole thing on a private basis, basically on a gold standard model, and hurls it out into the world and says, if this is valuable to you, then go for it. Now, just a little bit of history here to Bitcoin to help you understand exactly where the value of Bitcoin comes from, because it's a little bit complicated. People are funny these days. They look at Bitcoin and they go, well, I mean, that can't be of any value whatsoever. It's just a piece of computer code. It's not rooted in anything real. A lot of people who have studied actually some of the Austrian traditions say this, but actually the person on the street will say this. Well, what is a Bitcoin? I don't even understand. I mean, why does it have any value at all? Well, I was a little bit puzzled by this myself when I first discovered the full implications of Bitcoin back in February of 2013. I couldn't quite figure it out because it takes a long time. One of the reasons we have a hard time figuring it out is that we're not used to currency being united with the payment system. Those are usually separate institutions. One is the dollar, the other is Visa. One is the euro, the other is PayPal, whatever. So we have the transmission mechanism being different from the currency, but within Bitcoin, those are absolutely united. In fact, I would argue that the fundamental value of Bitcoin comes from its incredible payment system wrapped up in the blockchain. And I think that the history demonstrates this. And on January 9th, when the Genesis block came out, 2009, Bitcoin was worth absolutely nothing. It had no value on the markets whatsoever. But I was looking back at the data to find that it was being traded and about 100 trades a day on average between January 9th and October 5th of 2009. So what was going on? What was being traded? What was happening was geeks and nerds and sort of internet junkies who were testing out the viability of the blockchain to see if it actually worked, if it actually could be confirmed minute by minute, and see if the system actually, if the ledger balanced, and if the mining system really did work, so that the people who were confirming transactions got the first newly created Bitcoins and the mining system. So, and the code was tweaked a lot in the first 6 months of use. The developers Satoshi's code was not perfect. In fact, I think only about 20% of his original code survives to this day. So it was tweaked and got better and better. In fact, I heard at some point that the original system did not use a public key for the sending address. It actually used the IP address, which is obviously a problem. So that was fixed, and so public keys were used on both ends of the transactions. That's just one big change that occurred. So on October 5th, 2009, we began to see the first evidence that Bitcoin could actually obtain a value in itself. So why does it become valuable? Well, it becomes very useful as an information bit. If you can actually commodify and attach a property title to a unit of information, make it divisible, and transport it around the world without using any third party, but using this a purely peer-to-peer exchange method, that's an incredible thing. Because what you're doing is you're replicating cash exchanges that you would normally have in person, where you're just offering property for another piece of property, just localized. And you've globalized it, you've universalized the possibility of an in-person exchange, essentially. It's like taking property from one person and giving it to another, except that now space doesn't matter. Now geography doesn't matter. We're no longer living in a world of geographic contingency. The whole world becomes a space for localized trade. I mean, that's an incredible thing. So the unit of account that's attached to this service then begins to obtain a certain market value. So the first posted price of Bitcoin came about on October 5th, and as far as anybody knows, it was about a 15th of a penny at the time. So pretty cheap, and there are a lot of people that mined it going forward. It grew and it grew, and people were absolutely amazed when it achieved dollar parity. As if that was some sort of benchmark, you know, when one Bitcoin became worth $1, that seemed to be somehow, you know, an epic historical event. And lots of the early miners sold off everything because they figured it was a bubble and that was the end of it, you know, which they very much regret to this day. Then, of course, it grew and it grew and it's gone through these series of bubbles and crashes. I first got interested in it when it was about $12. And began to write about it as a very cool technology. I was scrambling hard, you can imagine, to try to get up to speed on things like cryptography, to reread Hayek's amazing monograph from 1974 called The Denationalization of Money, where he actually speculated about the possibility of reinventing a private currency, to begin to understand the role of distributed networks and to understand the blockchain. But even before I had fully understood it, I began to write about it, saying, you know what? I had dismissed this crazy thing for 2 years, and now I'm pretty much all in. I hadn't entirely understood its relationship to Austrian monetary theory. That took me about 12 months of more reflection and study. But in those months I started writing about it, the price soared up to, I think, about so as high as $260, I think, in the spring of 2013. And, you know, as you know, I come out of this sort of Austrian community, and I hadn't realized this, but I was one of the first people in the space out of the Austrian tradition that began to say, hey, Bitcoin is the real deal. And it was very interesting to me because I got heavily criticized for this, like I had fallen for some sort of internet hoax, you know. And moreover, it was very interesting. People began to sort of complain that I had blown up a bubble, which was an amazing claim because, I mean, if I had the capability through my own writing to blow up a bubble from $12 to $260 on an asset like that, I would be doing that like all the time. I would make that my full-time job. That would be utterly fantastic. So, just a few more comments here. In terms of payment systems, I'm sure because you're at this conference, all of you have used Bitcoin, so you understand how it feels. It's a completely different technology from any existing payment system. It's vastly easier, it's vastly faster, it's infinitely more secure. There's no chance of identity theft and fraud associated with Bitcoin. People will name things about who are having their Bitcoin stolen and things like this. This is almost entirely user error or traceable to holes in wallet technology and things like that. It's not the Bitcoin protocol itself. That's the problem. It's a completely different system. It also holds out the possibility of massive global financial liberation. And this is something that I've been writing a ton about because I think it's extremely significant. There are probably half of humanity, if not more. Andreas Antonopoulos says it's closer to 5 billion people, I don't know if that's right, who don't have access to trust-based systems of geographically non-contiguous indirect monetary exchange, which is to say they don't have credit cards, they don't have access to banks, and they don't have a credit line that enable them to incorporate themselves into the digital global economy. A good example of that phenomenon comes from my friend who runs the Women's Annex Foundation of Afghanistan. What she did was she's opened up clinics all over the country to teach women computer code and web design and that sort of thing in hopes of kind of leading to their own personal empowerment and personal liberation. And she opened this clinic up in 2012 and quickly discovered a real serious problem, that while the women could learn all kinds of computer skills and computer code and be amazing in terms of the value, they had no way to actually get paid personally for their efforts. They could not open up bank accounts because either they weren't living near population centers, or when they go into a bank, by law and custom, women are just simply not allowed to bank. They had to rely entirely on their fathers or husbands, and they didn't have access in any way. And that was when she discovered Bitcoin. She suddenly realized, oh my goodness, here's a currency that these women could actually get paid in using their smartphones. And if they had internet access, they could actually obtain these things, and they could offer service in exchange for money. And suddenly it completely made sense. Now, this is a woman who has no political bent whatsoever. She's just purely interested in seeing poor people poor oppressed people climb out of their life situation into a better life situation, and sees that Bitcoin is the way forward. So she began to accept Bitcoin donations, and now her Annex Foundation is just doing extremely well, and she's doing great work. And this is just the beginning, actually. These people are discovering this all over the world today. An actual system that could lead to the incorporation of billions of people who are currently excluded from the worldwide division of labor into the global economy. I mean, without Bitcoin and without a trust-based system of payment provision, you're restricted to local trade, essentially. I mean, which is another way of saying you're doomed to poverty. Bitcoin offers a way out of that. National currencies just simply cannot do this. The Bill Gates Foundation has been working for 10 years to try to deal with the problem of global financial exclusion, to try to get people rolled into the digital economy, but they've had zero success because they're working with the wrong tool. The wrong tool is national money. The right tool is Bitcoin. Now let me make a few final comments here on monetary reform, because I think this is the single most revolutionary aspect of Bitcoin, and I think it's going to lead to a vast political reform too. We have to remember that the monetary system has been dissatisfactory for hundreds of years, essentially. Like in the case of the United States, we've had nothing but problems ever since the American Revolution, which led to a massive hyperinflation. The new system of money that came out of that was dominated by the speaker banks, the national banks and local banks. We've never had a purely competitive system. After the Civil War, inflation destroyed the money. There was an attempt to institute a gold standard, but it was very imperfect. We, all throughout the 19th century, the planners and politicians who ran the monetary system were making all kinds of mistakes, bailing out banks, establishing national banks, having a bimetallism standard where they tie the value of gold to the value of silver. Nothing that has ever in the money making realm ever been entirely free. But the Federal Reserve came about as a fix, or at least so people believed. The panic of 1907 led to the last straw, a massive boom and bust crash that put tremendous strains on the banking system. And so the attempt was to create a kind of centralized system with infinite amounts of liquidity that would enable them to control inflation, control business cycles. And of course, we know what happened as a result. I mean, the very first thing that happened is the state abused its new banking system, the central bank, to go to finance World War I. And so it was all over the world. And World War I definitely would not have happened without the central bank. And ever since then, we've seen just unrelenting efforts at top-down reform. The system failed again in the early 1930s with the massive banking panics and bank closures and that sort of things. FDR confiscated gold, devalued it, devalued the dollar, and and it was further centralized the system. After World War II, there was another top-down attempt to create a global monetary standard where the dollar became the basis of global trade, and gold flows would be restricted to between countries under a system called the Global Exchange Rate. And, that, of course, fell apart too. So Richard Nixon institutes a new system and says, okay, look, we finally got it right. We're going to get rid of this gold nonsense. We're going to have just purely paper money. We'll put super smart people with a lot of power, a lot of resources in charge of it. We finally got the ideal monetary system. 4 years later, the U.S. economy collapsed into this massive stagflation situation where you had a high unemployment and high inflation, leading to a very dangerous situation in 1979 that was on the verge of becoming hyperinflation, that disgorged massive amounts of savings. It was just a calamity. I mean, so Richard Nixon's top-down solution didn't work either. And so it's been ever since. 2008 was really, in many ways, the last straw. You know, Bernanke created trillions of dollars to buy out failed mortgage-backed securities and fill up the banking system with fake reserves so they can be liquid again and pretend to be these bankrupt institutions and zombie institutions that essentially pretend to be profitable when they're not. And it was at that very point that Satoshi came up with Bitcoin as a genuine alternative. Now, I think it's very interesting for those of us who are fascinated with free markets and with the idea of the gold standard. People like Udina Mises have been advocating a different direction for a full century. He said, look, we need to restore the gold standard. We need to get rid of government controls. We need to get rid of monetary centralization and make the dollar or whatever currency convertible to something real that lives outside of politics. The great flaw in Mises's plan was that it always relied on politicians to implement it. And that's a serious problem. I mean, this has always been a problem for my friend Ron Paul, for example, who has been a long-time advocate of the gold standard. The problem is that every time he would get a commission together to study the gold standard, the commission would be appointed and packed with opponents of the gold standard, and they would recommend against it. And this had become really just an unsolvable problem. We know the monetary system is terrible, but nobody has the incentive, political incentive, to change it and fix it. That's where Bitcoin is amazing. It was a bottom-up reform, not a top-down reform. It was invented organically by computer programmers using all the coolest, newest technology. It was never proposed in the American Economic Review. There wasn't a testimony in the Senate Banking Committee. The Federal Reserve knew and heard nothing about it. In fact, Federal Reserve officials have been laughing and dismissing Bitcoin for years. Thought it was just idiotic. So instead of coming through the conventional top-down channels, it was proposed as a free product on the internet forum, and the code released to the world. An amazing thing. I think this is a very interesting lesson for us going forward, those of us who are concerned about human freedom. What is the right pathway to reform? I think the pathway to reform is not top-down. The politicians and monetary officials don't want to change. The right path to reform is bottom-up, using these amazing new revolutionary technologies, distributed networks and cryptography and open source programming and the value of internet bits. Put them all together and you have the emergence of essentially a new world. It's not just Bitcoin. We have ride-sharing services destroying local taxi cab monopolies. We have peer-to-peer technologies that allow you to rent out your homes that are making a mess of zoning regulations. These kinds of technologies are just going crazy. These peer-to-peer, bit-by-bit technologies are upending the world as we know it. In fact, this is the subject of my new book that I've been working on obsessively for about the last month. It's coming out, I think, in the next 3 weeks. I hope with an introduction by Patrick Byrne of Overstock.com. It's only about 150 pages, but it's kind of a manifesto of this type of reform. So it's not just Bitcoin, it's a whole full suite of technologies that are bringing back the idea of self-determination. self-liberation. With regard to Bitcoin in particular, it's, as you've undoubtedly talked about today, it's not just about money. It's about any kind of commodifiable and titled information that can be put on the blockchain to be made non-forgeable and to be timestamped and become a source of essentially alternative legal order. It was my privilege a couple of weeks ago, or 3 weeks ago, at Disneyland to actually officiate at a blockchain wedding, where the couple posted their vows on the blockchain, and that was a beautiful and exciting occasion for me because it holds up the possibility of denationalization of marriage too. But it's just begun. We're going to see that in the realm of stock markets and so many other things. Let's quick last final comment and take some questions. Of course, the politicians don't like it, and they're scrambling right now. I've been very intrigued at the response to New York's bit license, for example. The entire Bitcoin community was furious about this. They ran intellectual circles around the regulators, blew them back, intimidated them. That regulation was not imposed. They're going back to the drawing board now. Regulators are actually terrified of it because they realize if they get it wrong, there'll be laughingstocks, and also they will incentivize people to leave the national monetary system and convert all their assets into Bitcoin and just live in the Bitcoin space where you can actually, in effect, live in an unregulated world. This is a serious problem for the regulators, so the regulations have to be somewhat intelligent. And I don't really know how this happens because really regulating Bitcoin is like, according to the current laws, is like finding a square peg and a round hole. It's a serious problem. I think it's going to be a long time until we work this out. My point is that they can slow us down with these kind of regulations, but ultimately they cannot stop it. This is the stuff of progress, and it's coming whether the central elites like it or not. It's relentless and unrelenting. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. So I will take the microphone around. I can't hear, we can repeat it to you.
Okay.
Does anybody have questions?
So what do you see being the next kind of big change or evolution? You know, what's the thing that you're looking out for to see adjust or change? You know, kind of next
listen, I didn't get the second part. What do I see as the next big change in Bitcoin or in peer-to-peer technology generally?
I would say in Bitcoin, but in the kind of geopolitical markets type space. Kind of in real life.
Well, the beautiful thing about all these technologies is that they occur in bit-by-bit improvement. I was thinking about this morning. It's so different. It's like when politicians pass their new bills, they debate them for a year, they come up with some huge stack of paper, they sit down and have some big signing ceremony, they announce their new big plan, everybody celebrates and acts like that's a done deal, that's the end of it. The market economy is completely different. All these little steps occur just on the margin, just slight improvements, a little bit at a time. I mean, Bitcoin is now experiencing its 5th year anniversary, essentially. Is that right? Yeah. Is that right? Yeah. I guess 5 years, 6 years. I mean, we have come so far so fast. It's actually an incredible and even breathtaking amount of change that's occurred so quickly. So I expect this continues to roll out. I find it fascinating that the pundits and the politicians are all debating Bitcoin right now and cryptocurrency and its role in the world economy. Well, they can debate and discuss all they want, but it's not going to change. Like Bitcoin essentially doesn't care. You've heard it called the honey badger, and honey badger of currencies. That's exactly it. I mean, it just doesn't pay any attention to this stuff. We're dealing with a global. Here's the thing: we're dealing with a global marketplace now. The regulators are dealing entirely in geographically centered jurisdictions. They don't have the capability to regulate Bitcoin in the way they want. I mean, this is just like, it's amazing. I mean, really, this is like the mouse debating what it's going to do about the elephant. The elephant is just lacking, and that's where Bitcoin is. I see eventually, and I don't think there's any question about this. In fact, I'm certain that the smartest among the regulatory class understand this. I know this because I had a debate last week at Boston University. I debated a regulator, a currency regulator, currency transmission regulation authority in Boston. And he basically conceded everything I said. I don't think there's any doubt that the regulatory officials understand that cryptocurrency is the future, that it's so vastly superior that it's going to continue to advance, and that essentially there's absolutely nothing they can do to stop it. I don't know what the time frame is, but I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years we see cryptocurrency being a serious and significant, even dominant player in the world as a currency over national monies. National monies will always be in demand because of the payment of taxes and those sort of official businesses, whatever. But what I see in the future is an emergence of a parallel system, a private system that outperforms and outcompetes the official system in the same way that email and SMS and text messaging is outcompeting the post office. And that's where we're going over the next 10 years. So don't lose heart. I mean, the price fluctuations tend to get people up and down. I mean, if it's going up, everybody celebrates. If it goes down, everybody's like, oh, that's too bad. This has essentially nothing to do, the price of Bitcoin has nothing to do with its actual function and utility to the world economy. Bitcoin can replace national money if it's worth 1 penny or if it's worth $1 million. It really doesn't matter. That matters for investment and it matters for your own personal fortune, but it doesn't matter for the function of Bitcoin as a currency. I'm also really, really excited about large-scale businesses picking up blockchain technology to run their B2B operations on a much cheaper basis than they are right now. Overstock.com is experimenting with this, and in fact, many Fortune 500 companies are looking at blockchain technology for handling their inventories and other sorts of things. So that's, I think, the next big step.
Do you have any other questions? Well, let's thank Jeffrey.
Thanks for having me, guys. Thanks to all of you.
All right, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.